going to talk about estimation. I'm Will Iverson, I'm the CTO. Let's just start. Who the heck am I? So prior to Dev9, I was at Apple, Symantec, Solutions IQ locally. So I've been doing technology work for over 20 years now. I've written 4 books. There's some of these up here, a lot of articles. I put the CMS at evals up just because I've been doing some of that work more recently. And then with Dev9, we're a custom software. We're a custom software development firm. We're actually based in Kirkland, so just down the street. And what we do is we build software for folks, custom software based on continuous delivery. So continuous delivery, if you're not familiar with it, is really, there's a nice great book on that topic, and it talks about the process of automating the delivery of software. And so in a lot of ways, what I think of continuous delivery as is the application of Lean to software development itself. And so one of the things that we do is we put a lot of emphasis on the automation because we want to make sure that the flow is looking really good for that. So some of the typical projects that we do CMS, which I just mentioned. I'd say Java-based web services at scale is our go-to. That's the thing that we do a lot of work around. That's a typical projects for us, include sign-on and identity at scale, so millions of concurrent users. We do a lot of platform modernization work, SQL, NoSQL. SQL, it's like almost I even talk about because that's just so common. And then NoSQL, we often do a lot of work with alternative data storage solutions. Doing a lot of different client side. Today, I'd say the most popular ones are AngularJS for the single page apps. So that's sort of the Facebook SPA single page apps. And then a lot of Android and iOS. And then we also, because we're doing this automation flow, everything from the idea into deployment, that means that we wind up working a lot with operations teams on getting them up to speed on DevOps. So we often wind up pairing our dev teams with the operations folks on those deployments. And part of that's Docker lately, which is containers. Any questions on that? Cool. Okay, so the agenda for today. First off, why do estimates? We're just going to talk about why we even would do it, because there's some people who would say don't do it at all. During that, we'll also talk about a variety of different approaches that people take for estimation. We're going to spend some time talking about philosophy. And the reason that we're going to talk about that is that you'll find that estimation connects very closely to culture and personality and philosophy of why you're trying to get the estimates. So we'll talk about some examples of historical figures and their approaches. A little bit of time on the Agile Revolution, which I'm going to call it the Agile Revolution. It's got a manifesto and the whole bit. Talk about Kanban and how we've been successful with that. And then at the last point, I'm going to sort of address a specific need, which you'll often get, which is a manager who comes and says, I just need an estimate. What do I do in that situation? So we're going to walk through those things.
So, I'm not going to hold you to it.
It's like you've had my slides. All right, so we'll start with the why. Why do we do estimates? So a couple basic ones. Probably the most fundamental one around estimation is somebody wants to get a project funded, right? So you need an estimate to get the project funded. That's the number one problem. Another reason for estimates is because you're trying to communicate and set expectations, right? And then the third reason is a sense of control and predictability, right? So if you're a manager and you want that control, you want to feel like I've got this thing that I can hang on to. So let's talk about that estimation problem. And this kind of touches on the flow for that core, for all three. Team member, somebody in the project, maybe it's a client, says you should do a project. We want to do a project to do something. It could be upgrade the billing system. It could be we need to do a single sign-on implementation. And so the next person up says, how much is it going to cost? Right? So then the less enthusiastic person just says, So you have this conundrum, right, where as an industry, we've spent years training finance people to look at software development projects as capital expenditures. For $1 million, I get X, right? So we spent all this time training folks on that. And so the problem is that we need to break that pattern. So this is the definition for Wikipedia of estimation. And if we look at the terms here, predicting realistic effort, person hours or money, incomplete input. Right? So that's the tension. That's why you guys are all here, right? Because of this core tension and this core problem. So, because of this core problem, it's not new. So I grabbed, this is also another chunk of information from Wikipedia. Grab this, you'll see the little bit.ly links to all the sources throughout the deck. This is a list of some of the broad types of estimation that people have applied over the last, say, 50 years of software development. So a couple of these you're probably more familiar with. So work breakdown structures, bottom up, with experts. That's the typical thing that we associate with classic waterfall, right? Interestingly enough, size-based estimation models are the most common. And you'll see if you look at this here, everything from function point analysis to story-based, point-based agile, okay? So what's funny about that is function point analysis, if you're not familiar with it, is an IBM-based model for doing analysis, and it's unbelievably granular and detailed, right? It's going through and looking at every single little function that the application is supposed to develop. It's part of what drove then, believe it or not, things like use cases and rational and using UML. Those were the fast, light response to function point analysis. So there are people who've said that there were at no point more than like 20, 30 people in the world who had the sufficient skill and training to be able to do function point analysis. So some of this other stuff dropped out. Some of the work-based stuff that actually came out of the space shuttle, like Gantt charts and things like that, planning for that. So these all have roots, right? Some agile teams do planning poker, where you get, the idea is if I don't know how long a feature's going to take, I'll get 6 people in a room, we'll all vote and see what point. Now, a couple of these, what's interesting to me is I've never actually seen anybody use them. So analogy-based estimation and Angel, to be honest with you, I've never heard of it before I saw here. If any of you guys have. So as if this wasn't enough, right? All these different approaches, where most folks actually have only touched on a couple. This is actually another set of estimation approaches that I've seen that are applied to other fields. Now, I could probably do a whole presentation. I'd have to do a lot of research to explain all these. A couple of these, like the Monte Carlo simulations and Markov chains, these are used in like some capacity planning simulations, where your problem is you say, okay, this is actually what my sister was doing at Microsoft when she was doing capacity planning for Azure. So the question is, how much server capacity do we need to build in Brazil or Spain or Ireland or whatever? So they use a different modeling exercise to go through and produce the estimates, which they then use to do the production of the software. Now, a couple of these, like using some of these minimum mean squared error, is actually stuff that I think is more appropriate. At the very end of this presentation, I'll come back and talk about how range bandit estimates are used in that model to produce simple, comprehensible estimates. But here's one of the problems with all these. Okay, all right, we'll take the worst case. So you go to your manager and you say, I want to use Wiener filter-based modeling for my estimation strategy. What's your manager going to say? Anyone?
There'll be some rude jokes.
There'll be some rude jokes, because it's terrible. And they're also going to say, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? And this is actually one of the challenges, I think, around a lot of the estimation stuff, which is drawing that line between something you can understand and present, and then actually being able to get it done, right? So if I said, you know, well, I'm using Wiener filter-based estimates, and then you produce this spreadsheet, no one else can read it, it doesn't do you any good. So even though there's this rich field of other alternatives, it doesn't help if nobody can understand it. I've had the experience of using standard deviations for modeling out estimates, and my business partners basically had no idea what I was talking about. And that's just a basic statistics tool, right? Okay. So let's take the next part of the problem with this, which is how much does it cost to produce these estimates? So here's an example with stories, right? So I'm taking an assumption here of, let's say it takes, you want to get your stories estimated down to a granularity of about 1 or 2 days per story. So let's say I said, let's just take it as a faith, right? We're just going to blow it out and build out estimates based on that level of granularity. How long would it take to produce that? Anyone? Yes? Weeks? Probably, at least?
6
And then-
months?
6 months, there you go. So first question is, would it even be doable? And the second one, would it be valuable? Right? And this is where we start getting into the challenge with the estimation process around your philosophy and how you want to approach it. So these are some cliche phrases that you hear a lot people talk about related to planning and estimation. So first one, this is a German strategist, which is kind of funny because these are some of the guys who did the planning that before World War I, where World War I was supposed to be done in like a couple months. We're all going to be home in time for Christmas. And what he's talking about here is, you know, they put all this planning in before World War I, everybody rushes in to fight, and it falls to pieces. So the moral of the message here is that maybe you don't do planning at all because it's not going to work, right? Then you have another canard, classic one. This is Eisenhower. So they won World War II, that's good. And his comment, his phrase, it's very, very, you hear a lot, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable, right? So this is, I think, one of the core conundrums that the Agile community is dealing with, which is there is value to the exercise of going through planning, but the problem is that you are going to throw it away, or it's not going to happen in the future. And so how do you deal with that tension? And really, I think the root of that comes back to this guy talking about the map is not the terrain. So there's an famous example here where he talks about using a map to get from San Francisco to LA. So if you just look at the map superficially, it looks like you should drive down 101, right? That's the shortest line, but it's a mess. It would take you 3 days, right? So the proper answer is to cut over to 5 and drive down. It takes you about, depending on how, well, this way I used to drive 5 hours, but that's because I was young, in my 20s, faster, whatever. But the point is that what you're mapping out and the reality don't match, right? So you have this problem, which is you have all these philosophies intersecting with each other, and you can kind of quote who your favorite philosophical interpretation of how to do things is of each other, and not actually get anywhere. Which to a certain extent, I think, is part of what you guys were talking about, problems with estimation. Well, I need to produce an estimate, my manager wants it because he needs it, so I can get accountability, but I can't produce an estimate because it's not going to work, and then the plan won't be real, but now I'm going to be held accountable for it. So depending on where you are in that position, you're going to quote, you know, Rusky, Eisenhower, you're going to quote the other guy, you're going to try and get these points across, but you're going to have problems. This, for me, is the metaphor that I found the most appropriate, and you'll see it, this actual graphic is used in a lot in Agile training classes, like certified product owner classes, where they'll talk about this cone of uncertainty, right? Where this is where maybe the hurricane is today, but you don't know where it's going to go over time. So you put together these probability maps to say where you're going, right? So when we're talking about the Agile, for example, 2-week sprints, basically what they're saying is we're going to talk about that, because that's all we're going to know, right? But here's the thing, right? It still comes back to that control and accountability problem, and you can even see that manifest in the Agile world. So you guys were just talking about, you create an estimate, you get an estimate, hey, you failed to deliver, and then you get to blame the estimator, right? And then you'll see this pattern. I need an estimate, but I'm not going to hold you to it, right? So then the question is, do you get to lie once at the job? Right? This is actually why, and I did a whole presentation before on organizational design, where one of the benefits of a waterfall project that gets budgeted for a 2-year period of time is you can come in and have a job for 23 months, and it's all fine. It only goes south the 24th month. The VP gets paid, PMs, the devs, everybody gets paid, and you can all live in dysfunction together and not ship anything. Right? So that's your lie. If you're the VP who just got commissioned on a 2-year project, that's your lie per job. So you get to go from one job to the other every 2 years, cycle. So the trick about estimation, I think, is that it's really about shifting that conversation from control to risk management. So what you do is you're basically asking the management chain, everybody up and down the line, the developers, to say, let's not blow up every 2 years and just have it horrible. Let's just focus on getting a 2-week chunks out, and that's going to make it a lot more manageable. Since you guys are, a lot of you folks have talked about being agile already, this is the iron triangle that you're familiar with for waterfall, fixed scope. Actually, this is a relatively newer one, which I'm amused by. Some of the regulatory stuff, these are fixed and the cost is variable. I haven't operated in that environment too often, but if you click on the link, it'll talk a little bit about, there are projects that live in that space. And then you get into the Agile revolution. Okay, so since you guys are, I'm figuring you guys are all familiar with Agile. You have the Agile Manifesto. You guys are all familiar with that? Seeing it? Cool. You have Scrum, it's going to blow the world out. And then you have this pushback, right? Now, if you guys have ever worked with Agile teams that said we don't need to produce any estimates at all. Does that work? Does it flow? No, it doesn't. So in an Agile world where what you're saying is that the cost and time are fixed, but the scope is variable, that becomes part of the flux. And if I have to produce the estimates around any of the scope delivery, well, now I've got a completely free ticket. It just becomes this, right? Now, since I figured most folks were already familiar with Scrum, I found this slide, which I thought was hilarious. This is an anime introduction to Scrum. And since you guys are already familiar with it with Scrum, one of the things is that there is still estimation banked in here, right? And then you build it, and then you have delivery, review, and accountability there, right? So we already are, even with Scrum, it should normally be some concept of estimation that happens in through there, right? It is a hilarious slide. Okay, so typical Scrum planning. And this is where I can tell like Scrum is actually getting to a certain level of mind share. There's actually little apps for your iPhone that you can use to help with your sprint planning. So you can and they're configurable, little app. So you can pick which point or t-shirt sizing set you use. So the idea is that your whole team can get the little app, and then you can all just flip up your cards during your planning sessions. So if you've done planning poker and you get into a group, everybody throws up their number, right?
What's the coffee there at the end?
The coffee, I think, is basically, I don't know, I want to parking lot this, or I want to take time to talk it over. And why
I
is
just heard it was that you needed a break, that you've had enough of the planning in order to continue performing, you need a break.
Can't think anyone would need a cup of coffee.
actually, well, that's a great, so why would you need a break? How long does a planning session take?
It, if you've got several hours blocked out, like, if you're really intense on it, you need a break in there to keep everybody
Yeah. Your 23rd,
contained and
your
not,
23rd consecutive hour of planning, you take a break, right?
And I think, like, I've never seen anyone use it, but I can imagine that if it's a contentious group, it could be helpful to take a little break and keep it in face.
What's the longest sprint planning session that you guys have ever done? Anybody?
7 hours.
How long?
7.
7 hours? Okay, anybody else?
Like 3 to 4 max.
2 to 4 max?
Maybe 2 hours.
Maybe 2 hours? 3 days, that's
Good.
my personal maximum. Yeah, well, here's the answer to that. God, we spent 3 days in planning. We should really probably just do 4-week or maybe 6-week sprints. It takes so long to plan it. So let's kind of jumping into some of the anti-patterns here, and I'll get to you in just a second. Here's the thing I like about planning poker, is that if you are used to working in an environment or a culture where, it's cool, it's Ed, he gets a free pass. If you're used to working in an environment where nobody talks to each other, and the first time you introduce planning poker, it blows everyone's mind. That's actually really good, because it does get people shaken up and start them talking to each other, right? If that's a problem for a group that you're working with. But the thing about Scrum, classic Scrum planning pokers, you start to run into some problems. Let me give you an example. Let's say I have a task where I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think it's probably going to take me 2 weeks of research to figure out if it's going to work or not, just for example. It's my gut. What card do I think? Let's assume I'm doing t-shirt sizing, just to make it simple. What card do you throw out for that?
Depends on the size of the other stories.
Oh, interesting, okay. Depends on the size of the other stories, okay.
So like room for a spike to do research.
I like that. That is a very good, sane answer to the question. But
No, no.
let's just assume for the sake of the argument that you want to get, it's an ambiguous task. Like, you don't know how long it's going to take. It could be 2 days, it could take me 3 weeks. What card do you throw out? Question. Okay, well, we're stuck in planning. Can't leave until we've got these things planned.
Try to break it down into more granularity if you can.
Yeah,
Just
break
make
it
it
down.
into a smaller story.
Okay. How about if it's something that's going to take 2 weeks to do, but I know it's going to be easy to do? It's,
Can I tell you later?
huh?
Can I tell you later?
No, we're doing planning. How about, I don't know because I have to go to the ops team to get a server provisioned. What card do you use for that? How do I capture that ambiguity? So, and this is one of them to me, is that I've seen teams say things like, I don't know, I have to go get to ops, I don't, it could take forever. I'm gonna throw in Excel. Oh sure, yeah, I'll do Excel. It's like, well, there's no effort there except maybe nagging somebody, which is effort, but it's a different kind of effort. There's no external dependency tracking, and here's the real killer to me, is that this then pushes you back into the waterfalls. Okay, you do a planning session, we all made our commitment for the next 2 weeks, what we're gonna do, right? Hey, but the ops team failed to deliver. But then you go back and the manager says, you guys made a commitment, right? You guys said to me that you were gonna do this, didn't do it. Okay? So, what do? The next session, you start wanting to not commit to things. Because you're gonna get burned over and over. So you pad it, or maybe you say, let's start dragging everybody to the meeting.
Just sandbag.
Hmm?
Just sandbag.
Sandbag. I don't know how long ops is gonna take, so I'm gonna put 4 weeks, and that's another card. Hey, that starts to balloon out my story points, right? Because then you can start seeing this really weird pattern where the manager says, well, I just wanna see how many points you committed to. Or another dysfunction that I see over and over, which is, well, this team committed to 70 points, and they got 80 points done. This other team committed to 30, and they got 22 done. Obviously, the 30-22 team is a terrible team. Right? You see this over and over and over. So the death spiral that I see around that is you say, let's generate the sprint estimate. Okay, we missed the target. You failed to make your commit. Now let's invite everybody to the planning, we're going to spend 2 days doing planning. Right? Well, the ops guys need to start showing up for the meeting because we need them. And we want them in the room, so they're part of the people making the commit for the delivery. Well, oh wait, I'm in a company where there's another standards and review board, and they're supposed to approve all the website pages that get put out. So I need to invite somebody from that to also be in the sprint planning meeting. Sandbag your estimates, and then the estimates get all screwed. So here's some of the problems that then pop up. Stand-ups or status reporting, we're doing mini waterfalls, we don't have our sprint goals, right? I've been in teams where they said, well, every time we do sprint planning, we always fail, and now the management thinks that we're a terrible team, right? And then they say, Scrum's terrible, okay? Just kind of getting away. That's how you wind up going back to waterfall, right? Because then, hey, maybe at least I'm only told I'm terrible once every 2 years instead of every 2 weeks. So this is where I get opinionated and we talk about Kanban. So I'm not going to spend the session rebaking through all of Kanban. I'm assuming, since most of you guys said that you'd already heard of it, we're not going to revisit the whole thing. If you are, I'm going to bring up something very quickly. Just to give you a sense of the scope of Kanban. So these are some sample boards. This is a Scrum team that decides to apply a WIP limit. This is the most basic transition from Scrum to Kanban. You put up a board. Just doing this will take your burn down charts and make them look from that to more like that. Right out of the gate, we've got a burn down. Burn downs always put the emphasis on creating mini waterfalls. I would highly recommend switching over to cumulative flow charts, talk about how long the work is, how much work you're getting through, and cycle time reports. How long did it take to get the workflow, right? As you get more complex boards, you'll see more structure, you'll see the policies be put up here, and one of the ones that I recommend is putting external dependencies in their own column. Because now then the cycle time reports clearly break out for the management how much time your team is spending working on things and how much you're having to track and work with external dependencies. So then you break that problem. You can go to your management and say, well, it takes us 4 days is how long we typically have our hands on a story. And then it sits in the ops queue for 2 weeks. If you want to improve it, cool, let's talk about that, right? But the team is kicking ass because we're getting stuff through the flow and we're not holding on to stories for a long time. Multiple client teams, completion prediction. This is where you can start to say, well, we do have certain things that we have to hit by certain dates. You can model that on the board. This is part of why I really like Kanban, because you're encouraging the teams to be agile and lean and really embracing that and building boards that customize it for your needs, not simply saying Scrum is the only way. We do 3-column boards, and then there's this other blob that sits over here for blockers, right? So, click through a couple more of these, you can get a sense. There's a sysadmin board, an operations board, support, sales team, and your RFP response board, right? We'll do our RFP response.
Not seen
Yes. Lead the purchase, marketing. You get the idea. Okay, so let's go back to our, back here. Cool. So, we've talked a little about Kanban. How do we tie that back again to estimation? So, my suggestion is to have multiple boards, actually, where the idea is the first board is taking, actually this next one, I'm just going to tie this into it, where you have a couple of boards. You have one board that's basically a planning board, and that board takes in epics and new feature ideas, and its output is scope stories. And so you can get back a little bit. It's interesting, you know, is 1 to 2 days, or is 3 or 4 days, or whatever your idea of a well-scoped story, but it's a way to basically pull in the work, pull in the new feature set, and then decompose it. Now you get an interesting question here. Who or what is that team or group of people that's involved in the planning board, right? And I would say, well, whoever's likely to pick up that work is the short answer, right? How much do they have in their queue? This is where you get into some whip limit issues, right? Like if the work would all, let's say, I've run into some really weird teams. Like there was one client where their team was a .NET developer, a SQL stored procedure person, a Java person, and a JavaScript developer, and none of them worked on anything that had anything to do with each other. But they just sort of got glommed together into this team. And then the sprint planning was just them assigning their work to each other while other people would work on their laptops. Okay, whatever. That was just how they did it, how their tech stacks work, how their structure was, right? And so for them, instead of having them do that meeting, which was kind of pointless but doctrinal, they were able to, that you could say, well, let's do planning boards and fill up everybody's queue. So the output of that becomes then implementable stories. And this is where the execution board then takes the stories in and outputs working software. But one other nice thing about this planning board concept is that it gives you a way to have more detail and negotiation with your product owner or your product manager about whether or not it's worth it, right? So let's say that an epic comes in and it's, we want to add a new carousel feature to the website for rotating fancy graphics or something. Okay, well, here you can have the conversation about, is it even worth doing it? Because as you do the decomposition, you can have the conversation about whether or not you're going to touch it at all. As it goes into here, then that's the stuff where you say, yeah, this is something that we think it's worth doing. Take that scope stories, output the working, and then track the external dependencies on a column on that column board. Now here's the next chunk of work, the next board to track, which I find a lot of companies around here have no discipline or practice in. I'm not saying all, but there are a few. And that's the idea of taking all that output, the output of all that work, and doing analysis on it to figure out whether it did anything useful. So let's take A/B testing. How many of you guys have clients that, or your current companies, where they do A/B testing of software in production? You guys do? Bing does, right? Yeah. Okay. So, and they have to, right? Part of it is, I mean, if you're competing with Google, who, I'm saying being competes with Google here for the sake of argument, and if you're competing with Google, Google does A/B testing, and they've been very successful with that, right? So some of the folks that we talk to, the idea of having more than one thing in prod, they can only get something into prod once a quarter. So the idea of flipping things in and out all the time, you know, blows their mind. But it's definitely the goal that you get to, because then that makes the process of the planning something that's driven in data and metrics and tying it back to the business success. Sometimes if you're lucky, you happen to have a piece of software that you're working on with A/B, where something like A/B testing is driving revenue decisions. Like if you sell a product and you can look at the conversion flow, right? Did we sell more stuff? That gives me a way to take the feature ideas that are coming through and their implementation, figure out was it worth it. Make sense? Questions on any of this? Yep. Okay.
Do you, like, would you say that the analysis that comes out of the A/B test results and kind of analytics would influence backlog grooming and / future sprints, and it would be like cumulative over time as far as your estimation?
Yes. That's the whole point, right? Like that's why you want to do the analysis. And the reason I put overall analytics or analysis is because depending on what you're doing, like A/B split may not be appropriate. In a couple of industries, it's technically not legal because you're not supposed to have two different versions of something in prod. But the whole point is to then tie a loop together. This is where personal bias comes in. I personally prefer to work in an environment where you're doing more data-driven decision-making and it's not as opinion-based, right? Now, that said, you do want new feature ideas, right? There's another canard, Henry Ford. If I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? So you definitely need to take the new feature ideas, like the brand new creative stuff, but even that you have to have a way to tie it together into whether or not it worked or not. Now, this is a little bit vague because I don't know what your domains are and what your industries are and your specific products, but you can get a broad sense of how they tie together. So, in this model, estimation winds up happening here, and it's an ongoing process, and you pay for it in little bits as you go along. It's not an upfront cost. Now, that said, there's still roadmap planning. Okay, so who does the roadmap planning? Product? Product management? Okay, so you happen to be in a place that has that as a discipline and skill set. Okay, cool. Any of the rest of you, do you all have product managers that you work with?
It's not like a steering committee situation.
Steering-
Like everyone gets in to a room and we do it on a big board and there's, you know, small ways.
Already, right?
I get, edicts from headquarters that say, this is gonna happen here. And it usually contradicts what they said last time.
Okay. So you're kind of in a, I'm not sure if I want to do this anymore, phase, right?
Well, there's some of that,
Yeah, okay, all right. So what are the skills needed for effective roadmap planning?
Meeting facilitation skills.
Facilitation, anything else?
Vision.
Vision, that vision thing.
Being able to like be talked out of ideas that don't add value, or like not be too precious about your ideas in general.
So you need
All
some,
political mapping skill.
you need some of those analytics to know what cost of some of these things is going to be, right?
Right, so maybe some of the first features that you might ask for is, I need the ability to know whether or not if we change anything, it made anything better.
Good estimation skills.
Good estimation skills. But there's that balance, right?
But what about, the customer, getting the needs from the customer when they want a faster horse?
Right. So pull it all together. And that's part of where I think the politics of the roadmap planning is important, because you're taking in inputs from all these different groups at the same time, right? The technical group wants to upgrade a system, customer wants this, your headquarters wants that, and you want to make everybody kind of okay, and how do you balance that out? What's the level of detail for a roadmap?
High level.
High level? PowerPoint, not Excel. Right, okay. Not project. So I would suggest that you have these two kind of roles, and they wind up working together to pull the roadmaps together. I put product owner plus product manager, and the reason I put the two sort of as a plus is I've observed, at least a lot of folks that we work with, the product owners, it's gotten better. Like nowadays, we do go into clients where they have a product owner who's gone through some training and knows it. But even there, they're often very focused on the tactical Scrum execution side. So they'll say, well, I've groomed my backlog out for the next 2 weeks. The team knows what they're doing. I've done my job, right? And it's like, well, no, actually, we do kind of want theming out for the sprints over the next maybe 3 to 6 months. So we kind of know vaguely where we're going to go, right? And do it in PowerPoint. It's cool. We don't want you to do things like break out where the buttons and the checkboxes are going to be or whatever. But give us a theme for where you want this stuff to go, so we do have a sense of what the longer term plan is, just so we have something to kind of reconcile. And it's connecting that loop between the planning and the analytics. And the question for the manager that I would say, for the management, for whoever's in that role, is did the analytics show that we're moving the needle? Is anything that we're doing making a difference? Are we getting any ROI out of these things? And whoever that is still partnered with the execution lead. And I called it an execution lead because so many orgs have different terminology that they use. Solution architect, dev lead, dev manager, team lead, whatever it is. And for those folks, I would say have them make sure that they're focusing on the flow and making sure that you are operating in a lean fashion, and they're talking about the cycle time. And now you get away from where kind of breaking that big bang conversation with the management and with the team. Make sense? So a couple of artifacts, just to sort of summarize back again a little bit. Instead of doing detailed granular estimation, focus on a product roadmap and making sure that you have a clean split Kanban board. Let's see, golden feature. So 2 4-week golden features gets back to the concept of, and this is kind of getting into where product managers often are then having to support marketing teams. And so you're working with them. At larger companies, you'll have inbound product management and outbound product management. Inbound might be features and roadmap planning. Outbound might be, this is the go-to-market that we're going to put together. One of the tensions that you'll get is a marketing team might say, okay, we want to run TV ads and print and radio for this thing. And we want to talk about what's going on. The lead time on that is 8 to 12 weeks, right? So I want to know what I'm going to be talking about at the E3 show, for example, or whatever events or conferences way in advance because of the lead times. So how do you handle that in a situation where you're saying, well, we're doing our planning or execution every 2 weeks? And that comes back to that theming and what I've called for a while golden feature. And the idea is to come up with one really tight feature set that everybody does commit to that's really simple. And part of the trick on the marketing stuff, and the one thing that you can take to your advantage, is that the marketing message has to be very simple for it to get across. So let me give you an example. This is an old one, but it's one I used out when I was at Apple. We were coming out with a new feature or a new version of the software, and it was going to have a long bullet list of features that we were going to implement. But depending on what was happening with the dev team, we may or may not get some of those in. So what we did was we built the marketing campaign around the fact that the new version was going to be a lot faster. And that was something that the team, the implementation team, product management, we could all rally around and say, that's something that we're going to do, and we are going to get that into the rev, and that's what we're going to build a marketing campaign around. So everybody understood it. It was very upfront. That was how we were going to deal with those long pole external support things that we need to deal with, but in a way that wasn't going to tie our hands so the rest of the project could be run in a fairly agile fashion. So the trick is, and this is where it becomes a negotiation, is what is the smallest, tightest thing that you can get away with to call your golden feature that you can go through the market that's going to tie your hands the least. So we spent some time talking about the split board already, and I think that part of the key thing is to move away from just sort of the basic Scrum thing, Scrum model. You know, Scrum's been around for over a decade now. There's more to it than that. It's okay. Let's talk about what some of the other options are and how we're going to evolve from it. Okay, any questions about any of this stuff so far? All right. So here's the last session, the last part of this presentation, which is kind of the one that I think is sort of funny, which is I just need an estimate. Okay, well, you spent this whole session talking about theory and politics, blah, 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 but somebody walks into the office and they say, I just need an estimate, I don't care. And then you put all the hedges on, you say, I don't have enough information, I don't know, right? What do you do? Right? Well, one option is you might say, well, it's great, I'll work on that, and then immediately go and start updating your LinkedIn profile. You could do that. But in some cases, we have to do that. So at Dev9, once in a while, we will produce something that we call a courtesy estimate. And we'll put it in big bold letters over the whole thing. It's an estimate, whatever, but you still have to do it. So, percent of the estimate, because I think you guys are sandbagging. Or the other end of it, which is the old military joke of, every time it goes up a chain, it doubles, or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, that starts to get outside of it's no longer has anything to do with science, that's all politics, right? So,
I think you have to save this so that at the end of the project, it says, you said it was gonna be 39 and it took you 50, and you go, nah, that's not exactly what I said.
right, and that's part of where then you put, it's an estimate, blah, 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 and that's where it becomes a tool.
But in reality, right,
This is
so
what you
you
said.
try not to show this to this estimate, or he doesn't understand
Right,
independent covariance.
which is why this is at the end, which is why I put all the caveats on.
Right,
So
right.
the VP of sales never sees this.
But what you absolutely not. What you can do with this though, and leveraging the fact that a whole bunch of really bad estimates, as long as they're unbiased, when they're added up, equals a good estimate, is to create safety for your team and say, we're just going to quickly hash through this. I don't care whether they're right or wrong. Half of them will be right, half of them will be too high, half of them will be too low. I don't care, we're just going to do it in 5 minutes, go. And you can be pretty sure that at the end of that, you've actually got a really good number, even though it's really, really hashed out.
And this is where this gets paired with the planning board and the implementation board.
Yeah.
Right, so this is the kind of stuff that you might be using as an internal tool for negotiating the stuff that's on the planning board in your epics,
Yeah.
right? But your development team, ideally, they're only taking stuff where you've hashed it out enough, you've decomposed it. The bit about decomposition is key, because that's what, a 2-week iteration team, you might still want to do retros even with the Kanban continuous flow board every 2 weeks, right? So we start getting this sort of Scrum-ish stuff, but it becomes, and that's where you kind of separate a little bit out, the implementation team in this big political planning
Absolutely, because by the
process.
time you get down to the execution board, the average story size is 5, and it really is. You can go and
Yeah.
do your statistical analysis
Yep.
at 5. So you can just count stories and that's fine.
Yep,
And when you get down to that,
yep.
I can throw out my experience. So we tried to do some system like this where we were looking for confidence intervals and ranges and stuff, and it turned out to be too complicated for anyone up high to care about. And I think also in my environment, the exact numbers or good estimates aren't really that important. It's mostly used as an input for prioritization. So looking at the ordering of the backlog.
Yep.
And then also the planning exercise itself. So knowing that anything that's bigger than a couple of days is probably too big to actually execute on. So it's part of that process.
Yeah, I mean, the most simple version of this is when you get a card in and you're doing your planning for when it comes on in Kanban, if you want to do this, you write 2 numbers. You write 3 to 7 or whatever the heck the numbers are that you want, that you think represent the board. The one value for me is that if I get a card in and then, let's say you think it's a 4 to 8, and then you get to 20 or whatever the number is, that is a flag out that this card needs to get just completely rethought because you blew it out. Which you can do the same thing with Scrum with the classics t-shirt size or whatever. But then that way it becomes a little bit of a fun game about how close you're getting and hitting your estimate numbers or whatever. If you're in a good, healthy environment, like on your execution flow, like the point about, well, they're just going to be 5 anyways. If they're coming in clean, then maybe you don't need to do this on your execution board, right? That's why this is a planning board exercise, because it's not something that the execution team hopefully has to get into the weeds on, because it should shake out in the
Yes,
averages.
we do.
Depends on your team and your makeup and your culture.
I think the other thing to understand about this, I'm getting geeky again.
What's that?
I'm going to get geeky again for 2 seconds. But I think it's it's better to think of this as a rebuild curve rather than as a standard curve. And that the minimum actually is the expected and the maximum is somewhere
Right.
rather than it being symmetrical.
Yeah,
Because-
so like these I typically would say these are like 10%, 90% confidence levels. Like that this represents not your absolute minimum that you could possibly conceive of it. On this one, I would say there's a 90% chance it's gonna take longer than this and a 90% chance it's gonna take less than this. So that way you're kind of chopping off the ends of the curve.
Right, can I draw it, just to illustrate? the
There's no
point?
pen here, otherwise I would totally say, yeah.
And you guys gave me a nice little one last time I was here. and I didn't bring it.
A marker for the
A
whiteboard?
whiteboard?
You did, yeah, you were giving it.
We had whiteboard
You
markers?
were giving it a scratch.
I didn't get any of those.
those.
You know what's funny is, on the largest engagements we have running, I've never seen any detailed estimation. Most of our clients want regular demos, monthly or less. They go into the demo room, they expect to be wowed with the work that got done and that's pushed all the way to prod. That's the metric. Other than that, I've asked, you know, because I came from a background where we did just really complex QBRs and heavily metrics driven report cards with our customers. Nobody wants any of that. We want regular demos, push it to prod, get back on the horse, regular demos, push to prod, and then just measure from that. And they don't want any smoke screening behind any numbers, any heavy metrics. And I'm talking projects of 5 million or more.
Right, and this is and I agree, and this is the irony, if you like, about this, is that there's a lot of effort and estimation put up front. It's very rarely any meaningful tracking to progress. And even to the extent that if the total project budget is reported at the end of the project, you're lucky.
Well, that's where I was coming back to that minimum
We always
viable release, is that it's always get me over the first goal line and then it can get super iterative after that. And so we work with a cruise line. Releases are very painful for cruise lines, like take it on a thumb drive and get on the ship and deploy it. That's not easy, right? So you do have to really care about the release cycle. If you're releasing to the web, or, you know, there's some marketing elements in that as well, but you know, if you can get something super viable for release in 3 months or less, right? So.
I think the problem, to me, is that there's this, you know, as a professional, competent professional, you want to apply a degree of complexity to what you do because that's part of how you feel confident in what you're doing. And then the tension is, you know, like, other people will have different competencies and do they care, right? So like, I come back to this, right? You know, like this is, go check out the link. I mean, I think you find it really cool because there's a lot of awesome models, right? That range band thing comes out of manufacturing. It's actually not really on, so these are the software development ones. That one's not actually on any of these. That range band thing comes from manufacturing. So like, even getting outside of the discipline of software development at the core, which these all don't fall into that, I think you come up with some interesting stuff. But, you know, I think it could be like set you up in a bad place if you come up with this complex model for estimation. Every time you talk to a client, you have to spend an hour explaining to them what it even means because they don't understand.
Yeah.
And, you know, we both maybe just make the level of
I mean,
rigor.
so my background, I'm a PMO, so I care about both things.
Yeah.
I care about getting I used to care about getting a good estimate, and then making sure that the business understood. Now, and I think maybe this is closer to your, and this is, I think, more of an agile perspective and along the lines of no estimates. You don't ask the question of how much it will cost, you ask them the question of how much it's worth to you. Right? You can figure out how much they're willing to pay, right? And then you scale the solution to meet the budget, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Because and you're talking about training or finance I wrote it down actually because I think it was a good thought, that we spend all this time training finance directors to think of software projects as CapEx projects. But the typical MPV of a CapEx project might be, you know, 10, 20%, depending on what your cost of capital is, right? But the MPV for a software project is either 0 or thousands and thousands and thousands of percent. So you really don't need to care about it, as long as you've got the marketing, as long as you've understood the marketing and the product. So that's about being effective rather than being efficient.
So like IRR, NPV, a bunch of the financial terminology, those are also things that, to be honest, most of our clients, people who run $5 million plus projects, they don't know what the hell you're talking about. And it's one of those ones where it's hard. That's part of why I come back to, like, from a cultural standpoint, that's part of why I put on this bit about the analysis. Because part of what I'm implicitly doing here is I want to, over time, teach the business to think with some rigor and think about their returns. Software, I think, is brutal because it comes with a lot of very hidden costs. For example, well, what does it cost you if you have a security breach because you didn't bother to patch something, right? And that's where on continuous delivery, like there's the aspirational and inspirational side, which is you get to move your software out really fast and we're going to have a lot of business value and update and demos and A/B tests and all that. That's the inspirational side. The fear-based side is every single piece of software in your stack, your OS, database, your app server, firewall, load balancer, every one of those you need to assume has a security patch that comes out at least once a week.
So the main, and I think said in another way, the main, a large sort of the cost that we're dealing with here are opportunity costs and real option costs.
So do you model all those things and can you put those into backlogs? Like when you guys do product backlog, when you do product backlog grooming today, how often are you able to put cost numbers on stuff that goes into the backlogs?
It's not possible.
Doesn't happen. It's weird. I think it's really weird. I think it's very strange that as a rule, people do not put costing associated with anything, right? And I think there was a little bit of that back in the waterfall days when it was like, oh, we're going to do, $2 million or $10 million investment to get this return out. Those days are gone. I think it's weird. I don't,
The cost estimation I've seen is just earned value management using iterations, like.
Oh, that's
it's gonna
cost.
take- Yeah, but
I
that's
meant
cost.
financial,
management.
like upside,
Oh, gotcha.
right? Like,
No, and they don't factor in like cost of quality and maintenance over time. That most of the software costs are really after the software is hit market and deployed and like bugs there and security breaches there, so I mean,
yep.
more of a challenge.
And I mean, that goes down to Wilson and Bears, and that's always been a problem. This desire to understand costs to the fifth decimal point when the value proposition
I'm talking about any
hardly
decimal.
thought about.
I'm talking about any decimal. I'm talking about order of magnitude. Is this a $10, $100, $1,000? Like nothing, right?
And the irony of that, of course, is that the whole point about Agile is that you never get cost there. You understand your costs absolutely, and you should do. Because you've got fixed teams, you've got fixed iterations, you know exactly how much it's costing, because they're 100% dedicated resources.
Right. And that's the root of
Really easy.
Yeah, and that's the root of the portfolio management stuff is, how much it's just costing as team assignment and how do you move it around. But then also gets where it screws up your, it can screw up your ability to do predictive stuff off of your story points, right? Because you say, hey, well, we have this team and they're going to run for three to 6 months building this. Okay, cool. I've gotten to a certain level of feature stuff on the backlog. I want to keep burning stuff on the backlog, but I don't want to spend that much money anymore, so I whack the team in half. The good news is now I've moved the resources around, cool, but now I've blown out my ability to do predictions off the old story point stuff because now the team's totally different.
Okay, I haven't come
What's
across
the
anything
time
bad.
with software
What's
developers?
that?
Like every 18 months, a minimum?
Sorry, you guys both talking at the same time, so what's it? What else?
Mine was just like literally peanut gallery stuff.
Okay.
And so was mine. I was just saying I haven't come across anything that particularly asinine, but I believe you did it.
Oh, we have people who they want to move people around every month. They're, let's +2 here, -2 there. Let's take Bobby and split them on 2 teams. And I almost think that in some cases it's like they're like, I don't know what I'm doing with my job if I'm not fiddling with the team.
So these are, you guys go in and work with other in-house development teams?
Yeah, so for us, a typical engagement is either going to be, we will do hybrid team. So we'll come in and we'll work with an existing team. We'll do independent team, either at their site or at our site. And so part of it is, especially like on hybrid, it might be, well, we're gonna put a team of 4 or 5 Dev 9 people and two FTE staff, because the FTE staff is gonna represent minimum load that we're ever gonna have on that app, and we wanna have that app get more investment over a period of 6 months or a year. And so then those 2 FTE staff may be uplifted on their CD capabilities as part of that process. So that's the intro to CD Deck, where I walk through like all the tools and plumbing and stuff that you gotta have to do CD, right? Because it is automation, but you gotta know how to maintain it and fix it.
If they're messing with the teams all the time, wouldn't that like screw up Scrum and self-organization? I mean, you're really not like leveraging the bid stuff in Scrum. Right.
Well, and that's where it's this wide mix, and it gets cherry picked, and what do you do? We're all in this soup, right? So we have Scrum, there's a doctrinal Scrum, right? There's the realities of what you're dealing with. There are, and I touched on some of those things that I've seen, I've been doing Scrums 11 years now, where, I see the same anti-patterns show up over and over. It's like literally the 20th or 30th time I walk into a conference room and it's got story point equals X hours. And they're fixed numbers, they're not ranged either, they're just 1, 5, whatever, and you see that
So
thing.
regardless of who it gets assigned to, they have to have the same hours.
Yeah, well, we said, everybody threw up a card and said it was a 7. Who it gets assigned to right out of the gate, so that's an interesting one, right?
So the new guy gets screwed.
Maybe the new guy gets screwed, or is it assignment, or is it pull, right? Like maybe you have a situation where I've got 5 people on the team, like, classic Scrum would be, well, we just the team picks up the next story as it comes, right? That's where then you can get this weird frustrating thing where this probably shouldn't be doing doctrinal Scrum, you would not be doing team assignments in the planning.
Right.
You're not supposed to say, Bobby's gonna do this story, Jimmy's gonna do that story, whatever. But then you get into this situation where the reality on the ground may be,
Sometimes you have to.
because of that, the skill sets or the config or whatever, maybe you have
Or
to.
the experience.
Or
Experience.
because they keep switching out team members, and so how
Or
are you
they-
supposed to?
Yeah, and that's where I come back to the continuous flow stuff to start tracking the metrics and being able to do it. Like another one for me is the Scrum side is, well, we just pulled 6 stories and then every single one of them is blocked by an external dependency, right? So you get all these weird little mixes of things. Like there is this aspirational thing about Scrum where what I like about it, the part of I got super excited was because it was a way to replicate what I thought were a lot of the great things about small startups. Collaborative team, we're all gonna get work together, we're gonna sit in the same bay, we're gonna get stuff done, this is awesome, we're gonna talk to each other. But then you intersect with the reality of corporate America, right? And what do you do and how do you deal with that? So for me personally, I've gotten to the point now where I'm like, I'm not gonna walk in to clients and say, you guys are idiots because you have external dependencies. I'm not in that business anymore, right? And so what does that mean? Now I have to figure out a way to deal with that. Kanban and being able to put cycle times out and being able to say, all the external dependencies, they go into a bucket, I can track the cycle time on those dependencies. If I have 2 external dependency groups, I can track them in 2 separate columns. And then I can report up to the management and I can say, my team's effective. Our hands on the story is 4 days. It sits for a week in the UI design review group.
And testing.
It sits in, testing, that's one.
You're supposed to be integrated, but it's not necessarily.
Well, that's where we at our core is a dev team, right? So we're gonna do our unit and our integration testing, and if a client said to us, we don't want you to do unit testing, flat out, we won't work with them. That's just.
You've had somebody say that?
Oh, yeah, we've seen people say all sorts of things. We had one potential client, just actually, that we talked to as a business development came in, where they said, we want you to build a bunch of Selenium tests for us. And we said, great, well, let's talk about your process and your flow. And they had 0 unit tests, 0 integration tests. And so we said, no, we're not gonna build Selenium tests for you.
Well,
You have to get, and we said, we will help you get to a quality level with your unit and integration tests, and we'll get you some code coverage report numbers. And once you guys mature to that level, great, then we can talk about web functional testing. And the irony was, the reason they called us was because production was going down all the time, because the developers were just pushing stuff off on the prod. There was no QA at all or anything. And that particular company, they were small, they weren't a huge company, and they just flat out said, our guys are brilliant, they don't need to write unit tests. And that was it. So, as a company, we do make strategic decisions about what we're gonna do. I don't wanna be in the business of building a web test suite that they can't maintain, right? I might get a little bit of money for the project, but in the long term, I'm doing a screw myself because now this web test suite's gonna break all the time and they're gonna blame us, and it's a big mess. So we have to have that. That particular scenario is the exception to the rule though, because most of the time when we talk to a client or a potential client, and we break it down for them, they're actually really happy because web testing is so brutal to do. Like you start getting into things like, well, I want to do, I have to support 20 browsers and, blah, blah, blah. They really appreciate that we can give them other strategies like, well, let's talk about separating out the front and the back. Let's build unit and integration to hit the web services that test those much easier. Let's talk about your platforms and stuff. And so they're usually really happy. That's the 90% scenario for us, is that we wind up doing that. So it's funny, we're actually, we're one of the sponsors for the Selenium project. If you guys know Selenium, right? So we're sponsors for that project, and we're on the page, and we get call-ins for that. And so what will happen is we will spend most of the time, several months working with the client before we actually start writing any Selenium tests with them, just getting them used to the basics of the testing.
Do you think that there's like a bit of a away from craftsmanship in coding? Because like things that come out of XP, like unit testing and like test-driven development, and a lot of the good best practices from XP are like not present in Scrum teams.
Well, Scrum, well, now we're getting into like just core processing and stuff, but for me, when I draw the hierarchy out, you've got Lean, you have Agile, Manifesto sort of being inspired by Lean, then Scrum as a project management wrapper, Kanban as a process, as a project management process and a way to handle things. XP is a set of development practices. They also have roots in philosophy, but they actually don't have any much to say about each other.
Right.
Which is why classically you'll see people, like a few years ago, the common thing was people would say, we're a Scrum and XP shop, because what they were trying to talk to process dev and sort of project
Right.
management wrapper process. And that's where it gets really weird and chicken McNuggety, because you'll run into a group where they'll say, well, we want you to do Scrum, but we've never decided to uplift any of our technical skill sets. So then the problem is then they get into the situation where it's like, okay, we'll have to do manual testing, and that takes us 2 weeks. Oh, well, now we can't make that transition. And so that's why for us, we focus on continuous delivery, because it gets into the delivery side, and then it becomes an implicit place to talk about all these other pieces. But really it's about the delivery and adapting the flow. Again, that's where I like Kanban, because I can start by going in, and it's a very light way of doing lean modeling. Do very lightweight lean modeling, and then start that conversation about how to get better. But it's not like doctrinal Scrum, where I go in and I say, there's one way to run your backlog and your process. It's like those anime girls, right? It's if I walk into a place that's not, whoa, that's the background, it's not my laptop on acid. So like if I walk into a shop and they haven't seen this before, okay, whatever. The most common scenario is that they've picked and chosen chunks of it, but not others, and it's a mess. Actually, for our client base, I'd say we run about 2/3 are actually, they actually really are continuous delivery shops, and in a couple of cases, they're good enough, but they're wanting to edge case, they want to push it better. They'll say things like, well, we only get a delivery out every 3 or 4 days, and we want to get it down to same-day delivery, or if it's fully automated, continuous deployment, not just continuous delivery. They want to get to where the audience is. So some of our clients are in that stack, in which case then it's a different set of issues. We have others client companies that we've worked with where, planning is 3 days, this takes, 6 weeks. Shippable is kind of hazy, whatever. One of the ones to me that's interesting, they've got times on here, that's interesting. So they've got sprint planning part 1 and part 2, 1 to 4, 1 to 4 hours. Interesting. Retro, 1 to 3 hours. But we'll run into people all the time, but we don't do retrospectives. Why? People just used to complain all the time and we didn't think it was productive. I don't know. Got a bunch of fun opinionated PMs in here. All right, so it is almost 5 o'clock. I do want to let you guys out in time to not, I guess you're already going to run traffic, but whatever. I guess we got some water and cookies.
Yes.
All right. So feel free to grab some before you head out. But any other, I guess, one last question if you guys want. Otherwise, we'll call it good. A couple of you guys didn't
Thank
talk
you.
too much. My pleasure. Thank you guys very much for coming.
Thank you.